The year was 1461. England was burning in the flames of civil war, a conflict that history would call the Wars of the Roses. Two great families, the Yorks and the Lancasters, were fighting over the throne of England. On one side stood Edward IV of the House of York, young, ambitious, and fearless. On the other, Henry VI of Lancaster, weak, often mentally unstable, and controlled by his queen, Margaret of Anjou. Edward IV, with the help of his powerful supporter Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, nicknamed the Kingmaker, defeated the Lancastrian forces in the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. The snow ran red with blood, and Edward was crowned king at Westminster. The people hoped for peace, but the crown sat uneasy on Edward's head. Henry VI had been captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, but his wife Margaret had fled to Scotland with their son, Edward of Westminster. From exile, she plotted to reclaim the throne. Meanwhile, Edward IV was consolidating his power and surprising the kingdom. Without consulting Warwick, he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow from a relatively modest family. This move shocked the nobles, especially Warwick, who had planned to marry Edward to a French princess to strengthen alliances. Tensions brewed beneath the surface, and though the people rejoiced in the streets, the kingdom stood on the edge of another storm. Not long after Edward IV took the throne, England seemed peaceful, but behind closed doors, conspiracies were being woven. Warwick, the kingmaker, once Edward's greatest ally, was now filled with anger and jealousy. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville without Warwick's approval was seen as an insult. Warwick wanted Edward to marry into the French royal family to secure a political alliance, but Edward had followed his heart over politics. At the same time, Edward's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, was consumed by envy and suspicion. Warwick cleverly won George to his side, and together they plotted against Edward. In 1469, at the Battle of Edgecote, the rebels defeated Edward's forces and temporarily captured the king. But they lost public support, and Edward was soon released. Edward wasted no time declaring Warwick and George traitors. They fled to France, where they joined forces with none other than Margaret of Anjou, the exiled Lancastrian queen. An unlikely alliance was born. Warwick promised to restore Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, to the throne, and in return, he gained the Lancastrian army's support. In 1470, they invaded England. Edward IV was defeated and forced to flee to Burgundy. Henry VI, long imprisoned, was briefly restored to the throne. But Henry was weak and detached from politics. The real power belonged to Warwick. Edward IV, however, was far from finished. In exile, he secured military aid from Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Within months, Edward returned to England. Old allies rallied to his banner, and even his brother George abandoned Warwick to side with Edward once more. In 1471, the decisive Battle of Barnet was fought under a dense fog. Confusion reigned, Warwick's forces crumbled, and the Kingmaker himself was killed on the battlefield. Days later, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Edward crushed Margaret's army. Edward of Westminster, the last Lancastrian heir, was slain. Margaret was captured, and Henry VI was once again imprisoned in the Tower of London. Not long after, news came that Henry VI was dead. Officially, it was illness. But in truth, Edward had him quietly murdered to end the Lancastrian threat once and for all. Edward IV re-established his rule, bringing a time of relative peace. But within the royal court, suspicion and ambition festered. Edward's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, quietly rose in influence, waiting for his moment. In 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly, shaking the entire kingdom. His eldest son, Edward V, was only 12 years old. With the king's death, a scramble for power erupted inside the palace. All eyes turned to Edward's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, known for his loyalty and cunning. Richard was appointed Lord Protector for Edward V. As Edward V traveled to London with his mother's family, Richard intercepted him along the way. Under the guise of protection, Richard placed Edward and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, in the Tower of London, the same fortress where Henry VI had died. Whispers filled the air that Richard had designs on the throne. Soon, a declaration came. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, making their children illegitimate. Days later, Richard claimed the crown as Richard III. The two young princes, now remembered as the princes in the Tower, vanished without a trace. They were never seen again. Rumors spread across England. Had Richard murdered his nephews to secure the throne? To this day, historians debate their fate, though many believe they were quietly killed, likely on Richard's orders. Richard III's reign was troubled from the start. His popularity with the people was weak and rebellions stirred. Across the sea in France, a young Lancastrian claimant, Henry Tudor, was preparing an invasion. In 1485, Henry landed in England with a small army. The two sides met at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard fought bravely, personally leading a charge toward Henry, but betrayal and desertion within his ranks sealed his fate. Richard was killed on the battlefield, the last English king to die in combat. Legend says his body was humiliated and buried hastily in a Leicester church, lost to time until archaeologists uncovered his remains under a parking lot in 2012. With Richard's death, the Plantagenet dynasty ended, and the Tudor era began. Henry became Henry VII, married Elizabeth of York, Edward, Ivy's daughter, and united the warring houses of York and Lancaster, finally ending the Wars of the Roses. Yet the mystery of the princes in the Tower and the ruthless ambition that haunted England's throne remain one of history's darkest and most fascinating chapters.